The Other Side Podcast, Episode 2. Challenges you to think about topics in a different light, to see the other side of the issues here. This is the second episode. I'm your host, Justin Spears. Hope you had a really good week last week. I know I had a very, very busy week this last week, which was good though. It was a 4-day week at my job. So off today, and wanted to take the opportunity to put together another show. You know, one of the things that I did this week is I have a number of different books going right now. And I like that in a way, but in a way I don't. I'm also kind of the person that likes to prioritize and get things done, finish one thing and then move on to the other. But I just find that oftentimes people will recommend things to me, or I'll just, stumble across something and start reading into something and have a hard time, focusing on just that one thing before I move on to something else. But I've gotten toward the end of finishing up Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and then also finishing up Philip Dick's The Man in the High Castle, which I got hooked on the Amazon show. If you have not seen, that's a fantastic show. The book is really well done as well. I think they've done a nice job with that. But both of those, along with a couple other things that I saw this week, kind of got me thinking a little bit. I love when literature or Hollywood shows can predict the future, and that's one of the things people say about Orwell and Huxley and kind of what the modern roots of science fiction, these guys that wrote about, futuristic 2020 type things and, where are we today? And I saw a piece earlier this week. One of the movies that I've always enjoyed, is a satire, but unfortunately more and more every day is becoming more like prophecy, is Mike Judge's Idiocracy. And I was reading a piece online where, the author was kind of talking a little bit about, reflecting back on that movie and, obviously how it was over the top satire. But when you look at, where we are today, there are certainly parallels, if not outright, accuracies of where we are as a society. And if you've not seen Idiocracy, I highly recommend taking a few hours and watching it. It's just, again, satirical in nature, but you'll also walk away going, man, he's pretty much spot on a couple of things there. So I always enjoy it when, again, in literature or in shows, we can kind of look and laugh at some things maybe, but then it is also kind of a sad commentary on where we are in today's world. So at any rate, I want to dive into what we're going to be covering this week. And if you took a look at the title of episode 2 here, what you noticed is it's entitled, We Are All Liberals, right? And I know some of my friends who may be on the right side of the political spectrum may read that and go, wait a second, time out. I'm not a liberal. I'm anything but. I'm the farthest thing away from being a liberal that you could be. So what's this all about, right? What are you talking about here, Spears? Well, last week I talked about liberty and freedom at the end of the podcast, and I challenged the listeners to think a little bit about those two concepts in our system and our society, our system of government, and to think a little bit about, the idea that those are kind of a paradox, right? That you really can't go after and try to attain both of those in your society, that really they aren't set up for that, right? That if you have equality, everything being equal, then there's no freedom and liberty in that, right? And so we have to kind of to then ask ourselves the question, well, what do we want in society, right? What is the role of government? in terms of what it should be providing. We talk about the role of government providing for common defense, promoting the general welfare, and things of that nature. But, what is it at the end of the day that we want our government to do? Do we want it to be involved in our everyday lives and, pick and choose winners and decide outcomes, right? Or do we want them to be hands off and leave us alone and let us choose what our outcomes will be? And so, again, kind of thinking a little bit about that, along with what I said last week about how important it is to kind of go back to the beginnings of things and define various different topics, I wanted to dive into this idea of liberalism, right? Where did this idea of liberal forms of government come from? And one of the things that I always attempt to do, right, it is an attempt. I don't know how successful I always am with it, but I've definitely tried to make it a point of emphasis in the classroom is to get students and certainly we could take this outside of the classroom too, and for the general public to think about what is liberty, what is liberal form of government. And I always kind of attempt to go back to the Enlightenment, right, and think a little bit about obviously the move away from European monarchies that took place. And obviously, maybe if you studied this a little bit on your own accord before, you may be familiar with a little bit of the history of liberalism. Certainly, maybe you've heard of names like John Locke or maybe even David Hume. Certainly maybe guys like Voltaire, Paine with Common Sense, right? These were guys that all had a huge influence on the quote unquote founding fathers of our country. And so what I thought we would do today is just kind of talk a little bit about the roots of liberalism and talk a little bit about the impact that has had, and then maybe kind of explore a little bit about where we are today with those ideas. Because one of the things that we need to acknowledge, and again, I try to explain this to my students in the classroom, is that our founding generation, our founding fathers, the men that were involved in, certainly the Revolution and then the formation of the Articles of Confederation and then ultimately the Constitution, they were influenced heavily by these guys. And, I think in reading through some of the writings, there is an acknowledgement that this was an experimental form of government. We weren't that far removed from life under the crown. And, when we talk about establishing new forms of government, even today, as our country gets involved in other countries' affairs and we talk about spreading democracy, if you look at, for example, the Arab Spring, and you see where we have gotten involved in trying to oust certain people that we feel are not fit for running a country. We're certainly currently looking at that right now in Syria with Assad. But we certainly played a role, whether active or behind the scenes, in the Arab Spring. Is okay. So you remove these bad guys from office, right? And these dictators, these brutal dictators, and nobody's going to try to defend their record of humanitarian background. But at some point, though, they did bring some stability to the country, because I think, as we saw, right, when you remove those guys from office, what happened was it created a power vacuum. It was just opened up for the next person or group of people to come in and ascend to power. And, sometimes that's not always what we want. You look at Egypt and what happened there after Mubarak, and then the Muslim Brotherhood comes in. Well, whoops, we didn't want those guys in office, so now we're right back to square one, right? And so, it's really messy on a couple of different levels there, right? One, you can look at, well, what's the role of intervening and things of that nature. But even beyond that, just the idea of a new system of government. We certainly see this in history too, after, colonial Europe kind of fades away and imperialism starts to slow down a little bit. And so now you've got all these countries that are now left to create their own forms of government, but all they know, right, is what has gone on under their authoritarian rule, right? You see this in the Scramble for Africa after a lot of the European nations pull out of Africa. And you still see the effects of that today. They're still struggling with trying to figure out, what forms of government are best and what's going to work. And so in that same vein, right, we see that go on. Now, obviously, we handled it a little bit better than what other countries have been able to do over history. But again, we have to acknowledge, right, that this was experimental, that, the idea of federalism, right? I mentioned that last week, that there's this shared power between local state governments and a national centralized government was an experimental thing. And so you've got that aspect of it. Then you've also got this aspect of self-rule, right? Self-government. That's something completely different from the divine right of kings. And so, again, trying to communicate that, right, in an era where you have no internet, no social media, what did that look like, right? The writings that took place. And, then there's this other level to it, too, that I find fascinating, that, today we look at Julian Assange and Snowden, and we think about, what those guys are doing, right? But somehow it was okay. When people were writing against the crown, we were justifying that in order to establish our system of government. But we see, though, the ramifications of that. And I really try to get the kids to empathize with those people as well, that, they were writing under pseudonyms for a reason, right? Not because necessarily they were ashamed of their writing, but it was because if somebody were accurately able to pin them to the writings, right, they could face very serious consequences, the least of which was death. And the whole story of the signing of the Declaration and all that. So, I won't go into all that, but there's a lot of moving pieces, right, with this, and understanding how much of a movement it was toward this liberal form of government. So there's that aspect to it. But then, as I said, what I really want to focus in on and kind of talk about is this idea of us all being liberals, in that we all kind of aspire to some form or degree. And we'll kind of wrap up with this as to the political spectrum of what we think the role of government should be in playing a role in our daily lives. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So again, what I really wanted to do, and it's going to kind of be a light episode in terms of, I don't want to get in too deep with some of this stuff, because it'd just take us down a rabbit hole. And so I won't get too deep into talking about some of the individuals here, but you heard me mention, some of the individual philosophers of the age, where this kind of comes out of the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment thinkers. And again, what you see here is a common theme of individual liberty, economic liberty. Obviously, you've got Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. Intellectual liberty, right? Guys like John Locke and Hobbes writing on man and the state of nature, right? And again, that's another study that we look at in my class. I encourage my students to look at what both of these minds were saying about man and the state of nature, and what does it look like if there is no government, right? Kind of making this claim of why we need government. And just this past week, we did a project in my government class where we took a look at the legislative process, and I ended it by talking about the role of political parties in America today. And so we got into this discussion about, Republicans and Democrats and the two-party system, but then also that there is room, right, for third and other parties, especially at local levels. But certainly we've seen, periods of time in our nation's history, and not even just recent history, but, if you go back in time, we've seen the Socialist Party that's had a, little bit of a foothold as well. Sometimes we kind of lament the two-party system, but there's room for others. The question always is obviously going to be, how big of a role will they be able to play in working into the modern two-party system? And obviously we've seen it's been pretty tough nut to crack there to get into that. So, we kind of talk about that, but then, we have this kind of side conversation, just kind of plant the seeds of thinking about even the idea of anarchism and what does that look like? And it's always funny because, certainly people have this notion in their mind, right? When I say anarchist, what do you think? And, you always think of the guy with the black mask on, or Anonymous or something like that, something violent, overthrow of government. Not that's obviously some, portion of that, but there are a lot of intellectuals, right, that called for some form of anarchism. And you basically leave the system to decide for itself. And to do that, that's the purest form of liberty, right? That is kind of what man in the state of nature would look like, right? How would we organize society? And so, I think that for the most part, even though these guys were proclaiming this idea of liberty, which was a very radical thing compared to life under the crown in the divine right of kings, they were fairly conservative in their approach to it. They weren't all out there saying, well, let's just abolish government altogether, right? They said, well, there needs to be a state, right? It's just to what degree does the state get to determine and play a role in our daily lives. And so you've got all of these different minds that are throwing out various different ideas about the role that government should play. And so, you just have some really great exchanges back and forth. And I encourage you, you may or may not be into this very much. I find it fascinating to kind of read through and see the exchanges that take place between guys like Voltaire and Rousseau. And then, as I said, too, you've got the great minds of the Scottish Enlightenment with Hume and Smith. And certainly you can look back and read through some of the things that they said. And then it's always kind of interesting to read other people's takes on that. I'll give you a quick side example here. Smith, right, especially in economic theory, The Wealth of Nations has kind of been, the Bible of modern economics. But as you go back and read through, some writers from the Austrian School of Economics, they critique Smith and say, no, he actually had it wrong on this. And so it's kind of, always interesting to see that. And that in and of itself, right, it should show you that none of what these guys were espousing is set in stone, right? This is all theory, right? There is no hard and fast right or wrong answers on how this stuff goes. It's all theory. It's all ideological. It's all your worldview. It's what you think. Now, then the question becomes, right, to what degree do those theories and ideas get implemented, right, into reality? And so then you can ask questions about, well, we've had periods of time in our nation's history where we've kind of looked a little bit more like these guys, and then we've had periods of time where we've looked a little bit more like these guys. And, which is right, which is wrong, which is better, which is worse. That's certainly the ongoing debate that occurs. And certainly, for whatever you think about where we are today as a society, and I said last episode that I kind of lament the whole idea of dialogue and debate. I would love to be able to have more conversations with people about these things, to get back to the roots of what these thought processes were, because this can help answer so many of our problems today. And I'll give you an example. One of the debates that I oftentimes have with my friends that are a little bit more on the left side of the spectrum is, this idea and the role of healthcare, right? And certainly you hear from a segment of the population today that, well, healthcare is a right. And I hear that espoused on the floor of the Senate and the House of Representatives by certain reps. Certainly I see it from people who lean a little bit more on the left. And I vehemently disagree with that. I don't agree with the fact and the premise that healthcare is a right. Now, certainly if you read through what people like Jefferson and Locke and Paine were saying, you say, oh, well, wait a second, Spears, it says we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property. And so that first one, life, people then lump under, well, healthcare is, providing. Yeah, I get all that, but I think that's a wild step there to say that. And I don't think that is what they were referring to when they say we have a right to life. Okay. My interpretation of that, right, is that they mean that you can't be deprived of your right to be able to live your life free of interference from other people and, more importantly, from the state as well. So again, from an economic perspective, when we analyze, healthcare, it's not as if you're just walking along and, you come across a doctor and they are going to say, oh yeah, let me take a minute and look at you, or that there's just this natural occurring market for healthcare. It just doesn't exist. It has to be organized by individuals, and when you study the organization of labor or of a market, that there are a number of different inputs that go into providing that service to people in your society. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't provide healthcare services to an individual. So I would have to get specialized training and skills to be able to do that. Those of which I have obviously made a decision not to pursue because either A, I don't want to, or B, I don't feel like I have the ability to do that. And so for whatever reason, right, the reality of the situation is that healthcare doesn't naturally exist in the world, right? It's not something that you're going to come across like water in a stream or fruit hanging on a tree. Those are things that you have rights to that are natural. Healthcare is not one of them. Somebody has to take the time to organize a clinic. Right now, we can talk about modern healthcare and the way our government has butchered it. And what we see is, and this is fascinating, we were talking about this in economics this past week, is the formation of a black market. Right? And what are you seeing in healthcare today? You're seeing doctors who are saying, screw this. I don't want any part of what the government is doing to healthcare and to my practice as a doctor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go cash only. I'm not going to play the insurance game. I'm not going to play the regulations game. You want to come to my facility and get services, cash only, here's what it is. And we just do it straight up that way. And so, that's a way of pushing back against what has happened in healthcare. But again, kind of getting back to the original point behind that is, healthcare is not a natural right. And so these types of conversations, right, these dialogues and debates about these things, you can go back to the foundational era of the late 1700s here in the United States, even going back a little bit further, mid 1700s up till, obviously today, and look at the progression of where we are as a society. And we can look and see, I see that he kind of predicted that was going to happen. Or, well, wait a second, what if we go back and we use this theory and apply it here? Those are the kinds of things I want to encourage people to do. Get away from the lowest common denominator. Get away from the Daily Show, the This Week Tonight, or whatever these cable network shows. That drives me crazy when people will want to use Trevor Noah or Stephen Colbert or Jon Stewart as authoritarian. Look, they can have opinions, right? And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. But if you're rooting your argument in what those guys are saying, come on. I don't know that is going to be productive. On both sides, right? Guys that want to go to us say, oh, Rush Limbaugh said, Fox News said, that's just not, you're not going to have a productive dialogue in that case. So, I want to encourage you as I'm introducing these guys, and certainly, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, read these guys, read what they were saying. Sometimes you'd be shocked to hear. I think I made a passing comment last episode about Hamilton. And I just scratch my head at what people think about Hamilton. Now, he had some great ideas, but he also had some very, very scary ideas as it relates to freedom and liberty in what would, essentially become the United States. I talked last week, too, about, guys like Madison, right, who essentially, advocated for the Virginia Plan and the Constitutional Convention, which would be the ardent Federalist position. And again, he and Jefferson both kind of look back and say, wow, this strong central government really is going to kind of move this way. And I think I made an error last week in saying the principles of 89. It was actually 98, so it's a little bit further after 1798. But this idea of nullifying federal law, right? Because they start to see the manner in which the government was starting to become a little bit increasingly more powerful, and what it did to states' rights and things of that nature. So again, as I said from the outset, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to hopefully encourage you to think and to look a little bit more into what these guys had to say. Now, what I want to kind of wrap up with and leave you with today is when I say we're all liberals, and I've made reference to the fact that we've got people on the left, we've got people on the right, and I always kind of use this spectrum in the classroom. And we certainly kind of show the political spectrum and talk about all the different points on that spectrum. I want to caution us to be very careful about pigeonholing either yourself, right, or others into a specific point on that spectrum. I think it serves a purpose, and it's good to kind of get your bearings as to what do I believe about what government should be doing, how it should be operating, what its role should be. But it's also, I think one of those things where you start getting into absolutes, and certainly there are people who are socially very, very conservative, but spend, on fiscal policy, they spend. The modern Republican Party, for example, comes across as very conservative on social values, but boy, they spend and spend and spend and spend, which is usually a trait of the Democrat Party, right? And the same thing over there, especially in more red states where you have Democrats who have to kind of appease to or play to moderates and Republicans in order to maybe win a seat or win an election who would be socially a little bit more open, but maybe fiscally a little bit more conservative, or vice versa. Anyway, my point to all that being is that, you can't just pinpoint one place on a continuum and say that nails me exactly, right? So try to avoid, making those kind of generalizations when looking at yourself, but also when looking at other people as well. Now, certainly, there are defining topics that individuals have that they would identify themselves as, well, I am Republican, I am Democrat, I'm Libertarian, I'm Green Party, or whatever. But again, just kind of keeping in mind that there could be this open idea of, well, I align with these guys on this, but I'm with these guys on that. Libertarianism in particular is kind of an interesting group because you sometimes will get people from multiple parties. You'll get some people that come from the left, some people that come from the right, and so you kind of can look at it and say, well, how do you see it this way? But reconcile that, and so that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. But I would encourage you to take a look at where we are today. Now, there are two current major thoughts of liberalism, classical and social, which classical would be your more identifying as conservative or Republican values, freedom from coercion, freedom from state intervention, laissez-faire, minimal economic intervention, certainly opposing the welfare state, right? And so it's kind of seen often it's characterized as cold and callous, right? Because you allow people to make decisions, and those decisions have consequences. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but the state is not there to bail you out if you lose, okay? On the other end, you've got social liberalism, which, again, government's got a more active role in promoting freedom and equality. You look at social programs like healthcare, education, the war on poverty is a big one there. Certainly fighting for any inequality, which would include like discrimination, certainly policies to protect the environment, and ultimately just a overall welfare state. And that what comes along with that is obviously a progressive taxation system to pay for all that, right? And certainly they are looking at the wealthy in society to get those dollars to pay for other people's stuff. So those are kind of then your two mains, and then there's all these kind of then other breakdowns that I like to talk about. There's conservative liberalism, which again would be a little bit more right wing. This would probably be a little bit more like your Tea Party people. There's the economic liberals, right? And that would be a little bit more along the line of libertarianism or neoliberalism. That in and of itself, neoliberalism gets a little bit more into, you hear people talk about neocons or the alt-right today, a little bit more in there. So there's some of those aspects of it as well. Again, you have your Green Party on the other side, which is, obviously focused on environmental policy. Socialism certainly is enjoying a renaissance with Bernie Sanders and millennials. You're seeing an outright support of social intervention on the government side, with government sponsored and run healthcare and things of that nature. So those are kind of some of the different degrees along the continuum. Again, that just is serving as a point to show that even those on the left and those on the right, you're all liberals because you are in agreement that government should be instituted to provide freedom and liberty and equality and all these other terms that we espouse in our society today. It's just the degree, the variation in the degree to which you think government plays a role in doing that. That we have to look at and have a discussion about, right? I think we've got to get moving beyond just identifying, right, where we fall, but then also having conversations about, well, why is it that way? Why do you want it that way? Why do you think government should provide healthcare to its citizens? Why do you think people should be, left off of insurance for pre-existing conditions, or whatever the situation might be? From arguments on both ends, we've got to start having more dialogue on that and moving off of just name calling or identifying well, you're just this or you're just that. That doesn't do anything productive. So again, I hope that has provided some clarity on the topic, and maybe kind of, again, encourage you to think a little bit about beyond, as I said earlier, just the side of, the modern day Republicans, the modern day Democrats, and that's all there is, right? Because it certainly is a little bit more than that. So that'll do it for our show this week. Again, as always, if you have any questions or you want to carry on the conversation beyond here, certainly encourage you to engage on Facebook, on Twitter, our email, margisonandspears@gmail.com. That is a way that you can reach out to us as well if you want to provide any feedback or ask any questions. So thanks for tuning into this episode, and look forward to seeing you next time.